Hi, my name is Chris Dudley. I'm one of the architects for IBM API Connect, which is IBM's API management solution. As you've been hearing today, lots of companies have APIs. If everyone has an API, how do you make your consumers use yours over other people's? Much of what I'm going to say here is not exactly rocket science, but yet it still seems to be quite rare. So, in the movie The Field of Dreams, you build it and they'll come. Misquoted slightly. That doesn't seem to work with APIs. There are a lot of APIs out there. Most of the consumers have a choice. So you need to make yours better than theirs if they're going to choose it. And it's an excuse to put cat pictures in a presentation. So a couple of topics to start with. Various assets of an API just from a design point of view, and then we'll cover a few other things outside the design area afterwards. There are different protocols when it comes to REST, to APIs. REST and JSON is by far the most popular, but as I'm sure here, there are quite a few banking customers who still hang around with SOAP. There are choices there, though. Just because you use SOAP internally doesn't mean you have to expose SOAP externally. We've had a couple of our customers who have had great success with using proxies, where you have SOAP internally, but you expose it as REST. We had one customer who tried it as a trial, just for very low barrier to entry. They just tried it on SaaS, so they're not paying very much. And they exposed an existing SOAP API that all of their customers used, and just get, here's an equivalent, but it uses REST. Within 3 months, 85% of their consumers had all switched over to REST. So I think a lot of developers, API developers and app developers out there, given a choice, would rather leave the kind of XML SOAP world behind. And there are newcomers coming on the screen all the time, GraphQL and async API for the event-based APIs. And it's always pick the one that your consumers want. Not necessarily what you have to use internally. Just because the back-end service is one thing doesn't mean that's what you have to expose out to your consumers. Some of this is just best practice, but best practice is not common practice. So if you're designing a REST API, use proper response codes. Don't just use 200 to mean success. There are other 20x codes as well, 201, 204. Use the right ones. Provide example error responses for what you're doing, and be consistent. Most companies have more than one API. Use the same error model, the same shape for all of your APIs, so that if a consumer has used one of your APIs, they're more likely to then go and use other ones without having to rewrite all of their code. And when returning error messages, return something useful, not just an error happened. That's not very useful. Give me a clue as the caller. What exactly went wrong, and what, more importantly, can I do to fix it and avoid it happening again next time? And as with everything, validate as early as you can. Part of this is providing a well-structured API that means the consumer, the caller, can do validation on their end before even invoking your API. But you still need to validate yourself as well. Don't just trust, obviously, user input. That comes into the security, which we've just been hearing about. Provide examples for everything. If you're using something like OpenAPI, it's a very feature-rich spec. It allows you to provide examples and samples for almost every aspect of the API, for response codes, for schemas, for parameters, for everything. And use meaningful examples. Don't just have a string for everything. If it's a zip code, provide a meaningful example. And if you return different content types, provide examples in those on the assumption that it's not going to look exactly the same if it's in XML versus JSON. And give code snippets. Developers, but they might claim that they like to think of it as efficiency. Realistically, most developers are relatively lazy. And so if you can provide something that they can cut and paste, then they're more likely to get started quicker. So provide curl examples. Node.js, other programming languages, provide code that they can just cut and paste into their development environment and get started as quickly as possible with your APIs. And by far the biggest pain point with almost any API out there is authentication. Everybody has to take security very seriously, so authentication is an important part of that. but it is by far the most complicated bit, especially when you're getting into sort of three-legged OAuth flows and going backwards and forwards with servers to swap this for that. It's the bit that everyone gets wrong. So document that with worked examples that somebody can follow easily as much as you can. Another example here you could provide is full SDKs, which again makes things much easier because there'll be a programmatic code that they can then work with. The price for that is obviously you need to support that SDK. Whatever format your API is in, use the capabilities of whatever you're describing it in as fully as you can. JSON schema is the standard of choice for OpenAPI. If you're looking at, say, async API, then it might be Avro. Both of them have very similar capabilities, and use all the capabilities that are there. So use proper typing. If it's a number, say that it's a number. Don't just have it as a string. And certainly don't have Booleans as strings. That'll be a recipe for disaster. There are added options you can add for things like format. If you have a string in OpenAPI, you can then have an optional format field to say, actually, this is a URL, or an email field, or whatever. They are advisory, but it does mean that somebody, if they're using your API direct in, say, some UI code, say in React, they can use that straight away, plug that in to do HTML5 client-side validation, which means that the input gets validated before it even gets to your API. And for the techies, you can do regular expressions. There are ways of defining regular expression fields in OpenAPI and in Avro. The downside of regular expressions is that while they're very powerful, they can be very complicated and very error-prone. Some people love them. Your consumers may or may not. Going beyond the API design itself, almost the more important side is what comes around it. We've had multiple of our customers who have deployed an API management solution, stood up a developer portal, published their first OpenAPI document and gone, why is nobody coming? It takes more than that. You have to build an ecosystem, build a community, and provide more than just a Swagger document. That's often not enough. One of the first parts to think about is what language do your consumers, your customers use? And that's not the programming language, it's what's spoken language. In many cases, English is the international language, but if your market is, say, only in France, then why would you not have all your documentation in French? Obviously, multilingual content is best. The downside is you have to get it translated. And the underlying point here is documentation is not static. It must be maintained. It must be up to date. It's almost worse having incorrect documentation than having no documentation at all. So the downside of having to get it translated is you'll have to keep getting it translated every time anything changes. To provide that content, you can use Markdown. Both Async API and OpenAPI support Markdown in there in almost all the description fields. Use it. Don't just provide paragraphs of text. Use the formatting features. You can have tables, code snippets, links to external sites, or full PDFs. You can provide all sorts of information in there to make it meaningful and easy for the consumer to actually use. And back to examples. Again, something that explains how something will be used. All people learn differently. And so one of the options that people learn from is not just written text, but from videos, and we'll come on to those later. But there are certainly ones who are very visual. And in order for those people to possibly understand how they might use your API, then examples and samples are definitely a very feature-rich area that can really help them. A live test tool is certainly easier because that applies not just looking at static information, they can actually interact. They can see, okay, what happens if I provide invalid values? What sort of error will I get back? They can have a play. You might not want them having a play on your live production instance. And that's where obviously sandboxes come in, where you could have either dynamically generated mock data or carefully crafted mock data that people can play with. The app developer can make sure their application works in a safe environment, and then they can request upgrade to production to start playing in the live area when they actually know their things work. But that live test tool can certainly help them get them started. Code samples, as we've mentioned, cutting and pasting. It really does help. The more programming languages you can have, the better, though realistically, you'll probably find that your consumers are using one of a handful. Different markets have different programming languages of choice, but realistically, while new programming languages come about every year, they take some time to take effect. So you only really need to target between sort of, 2 and 5 different programming languages for your consumers and provide samples that they can use, that they can cut and paste. An SDK can be great if it's a carefully crafted one that you have written. The price of some of the auto-generated ones that you can get, where you feed in an OpenAPI document and you get an SDK out, some of those can be okay. The downside is that auto-generation, like any code, can introduce bugs, and your customer will blame you for those bugs. So it's certainly something that can be looked at, but you have to take on the ownership of then maintaining it. It's not a one-time thing, and you have to be responsible for it. So if there are bugs, you have to then go and get those fixed. And authentication. Again, it's still the most important point. So especially if you're using OAuth, OIDC, those sort of flows that are multi-stage, provide step-by-step instructions that explain to people how to use them. No matter how simple you might think it is, people will still get it wrong. And it's easier to provide the documentation than it is to deal with all the support tickets later. And realistically, the time you have for somebody who's browsing the internet looking for an API that meets their certain needs, if they come across your site, they start playing and they're not able to get going relatively quickly, they will just go elsewhere. They probably won't even raise support tickets or anything like that. You have a certain window to get them going, otherwise they'll just move on. On the assumption that you have more than one API, provide case studies so somebody can understand why they would use this API. And if they use this API, maybe they might want to use these other ones that go with it. For example, if you had a loans API and you have people who are successful with that, well, maybe they wanted to look at a credit check API as well. Provide case studies for where anonymized other customers of yours have been successful, how they've used it. In some cases, your audience, for example, looking at your developer portal might not be technical. They might be business users, and they don't care about the OpenAPI and the documentation. They want to see, why would I use this? Where have my competitors possibly been successful using this? They can then go and point their developers at it to see whether is this something that we should be using too. Blogs, a bit of a dated concept, but they're still a very useful idea of being able to provide more informal documentation. And they can also be time sensitive. So you can provide blogs on something that's important now. Say you're going to an API Days conference. You can talking about your API, then you can write a blog post on it either before or afterwards, or both. But they can be more informal than your possibly official documentation. You can also add comments and things like that, and then try and get some interaction from the community. You can have forums, polls, all these sort of things for trying to build some kind of ecosystem and build a community. But there is a price. Not everyone on the internet is nice. Some of those comments and those forum posts will not be ones that you want associated with your brand. So the price for going for that sort of side of community engagement is that you do have to have moderation teams. They have to be policing it for spam. There are ways of using sort of AI sentiment analysis to try and sort of filter forum posts and comments, but they're not 100%. So it's something to go into with your eyes open. Don't sign up for then having a whole load of spam robot-based posts all over what will be your own branded developer portal. And obviously say what's new. APIs don't stand still. It isn't just a build once and then leave it. There will be new APIs, new features in APIs, new versions of the API. Tell your customers what's new, or tell your potential customers what you've just added. For those who are already signed up, it's all the more important, especially if you have breaking changes. You need to tell them what's coming, or if an API is about to be retired, you need to let them know in plenty of time. And as mentioned earlier, some people don't like reading text. Some people learn from watching. So they can be very successful with having short 5-10 minute type YouTube-style videos on a particular topic that somebody can watch, see how the person on screen is doing something, and then they can replicate that themselves. The downside of video tutorials is they're not great when it comes to search engines and somebody who wants to refer back. It's hard to refer back to a particular bit in a video. So they tend to be additive as well as the static docs, the written docs, rather than a replacement. One more thing. It's not a one-off. You have to keep going. You have to ask your consumers for feedback. What worked? What didn't? Polls are one way of doing this. More common is using things like Net Promoter Scores. But find out. Even if you have some sort of case studies, then you have some choice-sponsored customers, you can ask them. But be careful of then listening to just one voice, adding a feature that only one customer wants. Listen to your whole consumer base if you can, and keep making continuous changes and continuous improvements. An API doesn't stand still. It's a rapidly moving marketplace. Everybody has APIs, and if you want to stand still, then you have to keep going, or otherwise, even if you're ahead, your competitors will overtake you. But yes, ask your audience what works and what doesn't. They will want changes. Nobody's ever happy. They'll always want something different. And so our goal is to keep delivering it. And at the end, if you've done all of that, you should have a happy cat. But that'll just mean that you've achieved it for now. You then need to move on and then carry on and find out what it is they want next. Because while if somebody's happy now, they won't necessarily be happy next month, next year. So you do have to continuously make improvements and make changes. And that's it. There are a couple of blog posts which I mentioned earlier. So blog posts are good. Here are a couple that I wrote very much on this topic, if anyone wants to go and read them later. And that's all I had. If there are any questions. Sorry, I spoke rather quickly. I thought we were running behind time.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Do I have any questions on the topic? Oh, taking a photo here. Looks like raising hand, right? So question here, who has a business background in the room? Just to ask you. Right, some people. Right, so do you consider being involved in all these processes, right? Yes? No? Maybe? I don't know. Can you repeat the question? Yeah, some know the TV show, right?
You should be. Don't trust all that documentation to the API developers. Techies write awful docs.
Yeah, but this is why we put this in the track where we're more targeted to business, because I think the mindset of delivering APIs, you should understand all these topics, right? So that's the idea. For you today, where the companies are the most lacking in terms of developer experience, right, when they open APIs? To your mind, what's really the main pain point?
It tends to come, the pain point seems to come down to docs. Everyone understands that things like authentication are hard, and everyone wants documentation on it. Nobody wants to be the one to write it. So everyone understands that you need to have documentation that explains how to do OAuth flows, how to authenticate with these APIs, but they don't really want to be the one who writes it. Certainly the API developer, they've just been told by corporate, you have to use this security policy. They don't want to be the one to write it. So somebody has to, though. There are ways, especially if you do it pictorially. A load of words can be complicated, but invest in it. And especially if you do keep that consistency with all your APIs using the same security policy or the same error models, that consistency means you only need to write that documentation once, and then it should be able to be reused. But it would need checking, both by the techies to check it's technically valid, but also by a technical writer or somebody similar to make sure it actually is understandable by those of a non-techie background.
Then you should document to who? To the developers, like the consumers, or to the decision maker, the product owner, or the business owner?
So developer portals basically have two sort of markets. You have the API developer, the app developer who is consuming the API, but there's an awful lot of business users who will come to your developer portal too. And they might then find an API or a product that they're particularly interested in and then get their team to build on it. But they're not interested in the techie concept in terms of how to do OAuth. They want to see, why would I use that API? What can I build with it? And it's trying to strike that balance between the business content and the technical content in a single developer portal.